Your cooking is competent, Elena, but lacks the sophistication our investors expect, my business partner said, dismissing my sample menu in front of 3 potential backers. The investors nodded politely. My partner, James Morrison, smiled confidently and pulled out his own menu concepts. Let me show you what I'm envisioning for our flagship location. I sat at the corner of the conference table in our attorney's office, watching James present dishes that were unmistakably based on recipes I'd spent years developing. The flavor profiles were mine. The plating concepts were mine. Even the ingredient combinations came directly from my family's culinary traditions that I'd shared with him over countless planning sessions. This was the 7th time in 14 months that James had stolen my recipes and presented them as his own creations to investors, food critics, or restaurant consultants. I'd documented every instance carefully, gathered irrefutable proof, and planned my response with the precision I brought to recipe development. Because what neither James nor these investors knew was that I'd already secured my own restaurant space in a prime location, signed contracts with our best suppliers who'd agreed to work exclusively with me, and scheduled a grand opening for 6 weeks from today. I'd also filed for trademark protection on the restaurant concept James thought we owned together, using documentation proving I'd created everything he was currently claiming as his vision. In 48 hours, I would dissolve our partnership and reveal that every signature dish James had been promoting was actually my creation, protected by intellectual property rights he didn't know I'd secured. His restaurant would open with no chef, no recipes, and no credibility. Mine would launch with the authentic cuisine he'd tried to steal, proper attribution, and the culinary reputation I'd earned. Before we witness how a talented chef whose recipes were stolen for over a year used legal strategy and industry relationships to destroy her partner while launching her own successful restaurant, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes culinary theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing, and that recipe plagiarism should be exposed publicly. If you've had your creative work stolen, if you've watched partners take credit for your culinary innovations, if you've been the invisible talent behind someone else's restaurant concept, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic planning overcome exploitation in the food industry. Now let's step into the world of fine dining where a brilliant chef's recipes were systematically stolen by her charismatic business partner, where industry connections enabled exploitation, and where 14 months of careful preparation created the foundation for complete professional destruction and culinary triumph. My name is Elena Vazquez, and I'm a 33-year-old chef originally from Oaxaca, Mexico. I grew up in a family where food was love, tradition, and artistry all combined. My grandmother was a renowned traditional cook in our region, known for her moles and her ability to transform simple ingredients into extraordinary meals. I learned to cook at my grandmother's side starting when I was 5 years old, standing on a stool to reach the counter while she taught me to toast chilies and grind spices. She taught me that cooking wasn't just following recipes but understanding ingredients, respecting traditions, and putting your soul into every dish. Those lessons shaped everything about how I approach food. My family immigrated to Los Angeles when I was 12, and I watched my mother struggle to adapt her cooking to American ingredients and tastes while maintaining the authenticity of our traditional dishes. She worked as a cook in various Mexican restaurants, often seeing her recipes copied by owners who never credited her contributions or paid her fairly for her expertise. I was determined to avoid my mother's exploitation by getting formal culinary training and building my own reputation. I worked in restaurant kitchens throughout high school, saving money for culinary school while learning professional kitchen operations. I earned a scholarship to the Culinary Institute of America, one of the most prestigious culinary programs in the country. Culinary school was intense and sometimes alienating. I was one of very few Latina students in my class, and some instructors seemed surprised when I excelled in technique classes or demonstrated knowledge of French cooking traditions. One chef instructor told me my ethnic cooking style was interesting but that I should focus on mastering real cuisine if I wanted a serious career. That comment was offensive but also motivating. I worked harder than almost anyone, mastering classical French techniques while also deepening my knowledge of Mexican culinary traditions. I wanted to prove that Mexican cuisine was as sophisticated and technically demanding as any European cooking tradition, that my grandmother's knowledge was as valuable as any French chef's training. My final project at culinary school was a tasting menu that combined classical French techniques with traditional Oaxacan ingredients and flavor profiles. I made duck confit with mole negro, scallop crudo with salsa macha, and a deconstructed tres leches with cajeta. The menu demonstrated technical mastery while honoring my culinary heritage. The project earned top marks and caught attention from several prominent chefs who attended the final presentation. One of them, Chef Thomas Chen, offered me a position at his Michelin-starred restaurant in San Francisco. The opportunity was extraordinary for a recent culinary school graduate, a chance to work at one of the country's most respected restaurants. I spent 4 years at Chef Chen's restaurant, working my way from line cook to sous chef. The experience was invaluable for learning how to run a professional kitchen at the highest level. I learned about ingredient sourcing, kitchen management, menu development, and the relentless pursuit of perfection that Michelin-starred cooking requires. But I also felt creatively constrained by working in someone else's kitchen, executing someone else's vision. I wanted to cook food that reflected my own heritage and creativity, to create dishes that honored my grandmother's teaching while demonstrating the technical skills I'd developed. I wanted my own restaurant where I could fully express my culinary voice. At 29, I decided to pursue opening my own restaurant in Los Angeles, returning to the city where my family had settled. I had strong technical skills, a clear creative vision, and enough industry connections to make independence feasible. What I didn't have was capital to fund a restaurant startup or business expertise to handle operations and management. I met James Morrison at a food industry networking event in downtown LA. He was 35, confident and articulate, with an MBA and several years of experience in restaurant consulting. He approached me after hearing me describe my concept for a contemporary Mexican restaurant that would honor traditional Oaxacan cooking while incorporating modern techniques. James said he'd been looking for a talented chef partner to collaborate on a high-end Mexican restaurant concept. He had access to investors, understood restaurant business operations, and could handle everything from real estate to marketing to financial management. He said my culinary vision combined with his business expertise would create something special. We formed Tierra y Fuego as a 50-50 partnership, both our names on the LLC. James raised initial funding from his investor network, securing $300,000 for startup costs. We found a promising restaurant space in the Arts District, a neighborhood becoming known for innovative dining. The location seemed perfect for the concept we were developing. The early months felt productive and exciting. I developed recipes and refined the menu concept while James handled business planning and investor relations. I spent 12 to 14-hour days in our test kitchen, perfecting dishes that would become our signature offerings. James would visit regularly to taste dishes and provide feedback, always enthusiastic about the food I was creating. I shared everything with James during this development phase, walking him through my recipes, explaining flavor combinations, describing the cultural significance of certain dishes and techniques. I thought we were partners building something together, that my openness about my creative process was normal collaboration between chef and business partner. The theft started subtly during our investor presentations. James would describe dishes to potential backers using language that subtly claimed creative credit. He'd say, "We developed," or "our concept," when discussing recipes I'd created entirely on my own. He'd present menu mock-ups without clearly stating that I'd designed every dish. At first, I told myself this was normal business language, that James was using inclusive pronouns to present us as a unified team. But the pattern became more troubling when he started taking meetings with investors and press without inviting me, returning with stories about how impressed people were with his culinary vision and his innovative approach to Mexican cuisine. The first undeniable instance involved my signature mole negro recipe, based on my grandmother's traditional preparation but refined through years of my own experimentation. The recipe required 3 days of work, toasting and grinding dozens of ingredients to create complex layers of flavor. It was technically demanding and represented both my heritage and my culinary skill. I'd shared the complete recipe with James during a tasting session, explaining every step and ingredient. 2 weeks later, a food journalist published a preview article about our upcoming restaurant. The article described James as the creative force behind Tierra y Fuego, quoted him extensively about his innovative mole recipe, and mentioned me only briefly as the chef who would execute his vision. When I confronted James about the article, he seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset. He said the journalist had misunderstood his comments, that he'd talked about our concept and the reporter had focused on him as the business face of the restaurant. He said I was being overly sensitive about credit, that what mattered was getting good publicity for the restaurant regardless of who the press quoted. The gaslighting was subtle and effective. James made me feel like I was being petty about attribution when I should be grateful for any positive press coverage. He suggested that successful restaurants required business partners to be public faces while chefs focused on cooking rather than publicity. He implied that my concern about credit reflected insecurity rather than legitimate complaint about erasure. But the pattern continued and intensified over the following months. James scheduled meetings with restaurant critics, food bloggers, and potential investors without including me, presenting himself as the culinary creative force behind Tierra y Fuego. When I insisted on attending meetings, he'd dominate conversations about the menu, describing dishes and flavor profiles in ways that claimed creative ownership. During one particularly galling investor presentation, James used a PowerPoint deck I'd never seen before that included photos of my dishes alongside text describing James Morrison's innovative approach to contemporary Oaxacan cuisine. Every dish pictured was my creation, every flavor combination came from my recipes, every plating concept reflected my aesthetic vision. But James's name was prominently displayed as the creative director. I was sitting right there during this presentation, watching 3 potential investors take notes about James's culinary philosophy and his innovative recipe development. One investor asked James a specific question about technique for my mole negro preparation. James answered confidently, describing methods I'd taught him as if they were his own discoveries. When the meeting ended and investors left, I confronted James directly about claiming my recipes as his creations. He looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion, as if my anger was incomprehensible. He said that as partners in the restaurant, all recipes were ours, regardless of who physically developed them. He said I was being territorial about intellectual property that belonged to the partnership. The conversation escalated into an argument about ownership, credit, and what partnership meant. James insisted that his fundraising efforts and business expertise were equally valuable to my recipe development, that the restaurant concept was collaborative even if I'd physically created the dishes. He said demanding individual credit for recipes undermined our partnership and made me seem difficult to work with. I left that meeting feeling angry, confused, and manipulated. James had taken a legitimate complaint about credit theft and reframed it as my personal problem with sharing recognition. He'd made me question whether I was being unreasonable to expect acknowledgement for creating every recipe he was claiming as his innovative approach. That night, I called my mother and described what was happening. She listened quietly, then told me a story I'd heard before but suddenly understood differently. She described working for a restaurant owner who'd stolen her recipes, presented them as house specialties, and eventually published a cookbook featuring her dishes under his name. When she'd complained, he'd fired her and threatened to blacklist her in the LA restaurant community. My mother said she'd stayed silent after being fired because she was undocumented at the time and terrified of making trouble that might lead to deportation. She'd watched this man build a successful restaurant empire partly on recipes she'd created, never receiving credit or compensation. She said she'd always hoped I'd have better opportunities because I had citizenship, education, and legal protections she'd lacked. Hearing my mother's story alongside my own experience with James crystallized my understanding of what was happening. This wasn't partnership or normal collaborative ambiguity about creative credit. This was systematic theft, James building his reputation as a culinary innovator on recipes I'd created while erasing my contributions and keeping me invisible. I realized I needed a strategy beyond confrontation. James was too skilled at manipulation, too practiced at reframing theft as partnership, too connected with investors who believed his version of events. I needed documentation, legal protection, and a plan that would expose his fraud while establishing my own independent success. I started by consulting with an intellectual property attorney about protecting my recipes and creative work. The attorney explained that while recipes themselves are difficult to copyright, the specific expression of recipes in written form, photographs, and menu concepts could be protected. She recommended documenting everything meticulously and considering trademark protection for the restaurant concept. Most importantly, the attorney reviewed our partnership agreement and found significant weaknesses in how intellectual property was addressed. The agreement said the partnership owned all work product created during the partnership, but it didn't clearly define what that meant or how credit would be attributed. The ambiguity gave me room to argue that I retained individual rights to my creative work. Following the attorney's advice, I began copywriting written versions of all my recipes with detailed preparation notes and photographs of finished dishes. I documented my development process for each recipe, keeping dated notes about inspiration, testing, and refinement. I created a comprehensive record proving I'd created every dish James was claiming as our concept. I also started building relationships with suppliers, sous chefs, and other industry professionals independent of James. I made sure people in the LA food community knew me as the actual chef behind Tierra y Fuego's menu, the person developing recipes and creating dishes. I attended industry events alone, networked with food journalists, and established my own professional identity. During this documentation phase, I continued working on the restaurant development while watching James steal credit repeatedly. He gave an interview to Los Angeles Magazine describing his approach to modernizing traditional Mexican cooking. He spoke at a food conference about his journey developing the Tierra y Fuego concept. He met with a cookbook publisher about his recipes potentially becoming a book. Every instance of theft I documented carefully, saving articles, recording presentations when possible, and keeping detailed notes about what James said and when. I was building a comprehensive case that would prove systematic plagiarism beyond any reasonable doubt. The breakthrough in my strategy came when I found a different restaurant location that was actually better than the Arts District space we'd secured. The new location was in Silver Lake, a neighborhood with strong food culture and demographic that would appreciate authentic high-end Mexican cuisine. The space had better kitchen facilities, more attractive dining room layout, and lower rent than our current location. I realized I could use this new location to launch my own restaurant, separate from the partnership with James. I could take my recipes, my culinary vision, and my industry relationships to create exactly what I'd originally imagined without James claiming credit for my work. But executing this strategy required careful planning and timing. I needed to secure the new space without James knowing, prepare all legal documents for dissolving our partnership, and coordinate everything so James couldn't interfere or try to claim rights to my independent venture. I started by negotiating the lease for the Silver Lake space under a different LLC I formed secretly, using a different name that wouldn't alert James if he somehow heard about it. I secured commitments from our best suppliers to work exclusively with my new restaurant once I officially launched. I hired a PR consultant to prepare publicity materials that would establish me as the authentic creative force behind the cuisine James had been stealing. Most importantly, I filed for trademark protection on Tierra y Fuego and several other brand elements, using documentation proving I'd created the concept and developed all the intellectual property. The trademark applications were based on my dated recipe documentation, menu designs, and witness statements from people who'd seen me develop the concept before partnering with James. The trademark strategy was crucial because it would prevent James from using the restaurant name or concept I'd created even though we'd filed the LLC together. My attorney explained that trademarks go to whoever can prove first use and creative authorship, not just to whoever filed business paperwork first. My comprehensive documentation would support my claim to the trademarks. I worked on all this preparation while maintaining the appearance of normal partnership with James. I continued refining recipes, attending some investor meetings, and behaving as if everything was fine. James had no idea I was systematically building an independent business while gathering evidence of his theft. The timing for executing my plan came when James scheduled a major investor dinner to show off his cuisine before our planned opening. He'd invited 15 potential investors to a preview dinner featuring 7 courses of what he described in the invitation as James Morrison's innovative Oaxacan-inspired tasting menu. Every dish on that menu was mine. The octopus with salsa macha that I'd spent months perfecting. The duck tamales that reflected my grandmother's technique. The mole negro that represented years of recipe development. All of it described as James's creative work to investors who would be funding his restaurant. I decided that dinner would be the last time James would present my food as his creation. 48 hours before the event, I would dissolve the partnership, reveal the theft, and announce my own restaurant. The timing would leave James scrambling to cancel or completely reconceptualize his investor dinner while I launched publicity about the authentic Tierra y Fuego at my Silver Lake location. The day I'd chosen to execute this plan arrived on a Tuesday morning. I'd prepared everything meticulously over the preceding 3 months. My attorney had all dissolution paperwork ready. My PR consultant had press releases prepared. My new restaurant space was ready for its announcement. I'd rehearsed every conversation and anticipated every response. I arrived at our test kitchen office at 9 a.m. with my resignation letter and dissolution documents. James was already there, working on his laptop and drinking coffee, completely unsuspecting. He smiled when he saw me, asking if I'd finalized the menu for the investor dinner happening in 2 days. Actually, James, I need to talk to you about something important, I said, placing the dissolution paperwork on the desk in front of him. I'm formally ending our partnership effective immediately. These documents dissolve Tierra y Fuego LLC. James's smile disappeared instantly, replaced by shock and confusion. He stared at the documents without picking them up, as if refusing to touch them might make them not real. Several seconds of silence passed before he spoke. What? Elena, what are you talking about? We have the investor dinner in 2 days. We're about to finalize our lease. This doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense. I'm ending our partnership because you've systematically stolen credit for my recipes and my creative work for 14 months. You've presented yourself as the culinary creative force behind Tierra y Fuego when you've created nothing. Every recipe, every dish concept, every menu item comes from my work. I'm dissolving the partnership to launch my own restaurant where I'll receive proper credit for my own creations. James's face flushed red, anger overtaking his initial shock. That's insane. We're partners. Everything we've built is collaborative. You can't just walk away from our agreements and our commitments. Actually, I can. Our partnership agreement allows either partner to dissolve the LLC with 30 days notice, which I'm providing. More importantly, I've filed for trademark protection on Tierra y Fuego and related intellectual property, using documentation proving I created all the concept elements you've been claiming as ours. You won't be able to use the restaurant name, the menu concepts, or any of my recipes. James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. You can't trademark our business name. I raised all the funding. I found our location. I built the investor relationships. You're stealing my work. The accusation was stunning in its projection. James was accusing me of theft while I was exposing his systematic plagiarism. But I'd anticipated this response and prepared for it carefully. You raised funding and handled business operations, which I've never denied or tried to minimize. But the creative work, the recipes, the culinary vision, all of that came from me. I have comprehensive documentation proving I created every dish you've been presenting as your innovative cuisine. I have dated recipe notes, photographs of development, and witness statements from people who saw me create everything you've been claiming credit for. No one is going to believe you. I'm the public face of Tierra y Fuego. Every article mentions me as the creative force. Every investor knows me as the concept creator. You're the chef who executes my vision. The comment revealed exactly how James saw our relationship. He genuinely believed he was the creative force despite having created nothing, that his business role and public visibility made him the author of my work. His ego required that narrative even when confronted with proof of systematic theft. Those articles describe you as the creator because you lied to journalists about who developed the recipes. Those investors think you're the culinary visionary because you presented my dishes as your innovations. But I have evidence proving otherwise, and I'll be providing that evidence to every journalist, investor, and food industry professional who matters in Los Angeles. James moved around the desk toward me, his body language aggressive. If you do this, I'll destroy you. I have connections throughout the restaurant industry. I'll make sure you never work in Los Angeles again. I'll tell everyone you're unstable, that you stole from me, that you can't be trusted as a business partner. The threats were predictable and empty. My attorney had assured me that truth was a complete defense against defamation, that James couldn't sue me for exposing his actual theft. But I understood he was panicking, watching his fraudulent reputation crumble in real time. You can try to destroy my reputation, but it won't work. I have too much evidence of your theft, too many people who know I created everything you've been claiming. I also have something you don't have, actual culinary talent and authentic creative vision. I'll succeed on my own merit while you struggle to find a chef willing to work with someone known for stealing credit. I picked up my bag and turned toward the door. James grabbed my arm, not violently but firmly enough to stop me. I turned back and said very clearly, "Let go of me right now, or I'll file a police report for physical assault in addition to everything else." James released my arm immediately, stepping back with hands raised. He looked desperate and slightly unhinged, realizing he had no leverage and no way to prevent what was happening. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. You'll regret this," he said, his voice shaking slightly with anger or fear or both. "The biggest mistake I made was trusting you with my recipes and my creative work. I'm correcting that mistake now. Good luck with your investor dinner in 2 days. I hope you've learned enough about cooking to prepare 7 courses yourself, since you won't be presenting my food anymore." I walked out of the test kitchen for the last time, leaving James standing in the middle of the room in shock. The relief I felt was immediate and profound, like removing something poisonous from my body. 14 months of having my work stolen, my contributions erased, my voice silenced, all ending in that single conversation. Within hours, I'd executed the rest of my plan. My attorney sent formal dissolution notices to all relevant parties. My PR consultant released press materials announcing Elena Vasquez's Tierra y Fuego, opening in Silver Lake in 6 weeks, featuring authentic Oaxacan cuisine from a chef with classical training and family culinary traditions. The press release emphasized that I'd created the concept independently and would finally receive proper credit for my own creative work. The food media response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple journalists contacted me within hours, having heard rumors about the partnership dissolution and wanting to understand what happened. I provided interviews explaining James's systematic theft of credit, showing documentation of my recipe development, and describing my decision to launch independently rather than continue being exploited. Several journalists had suspected something was wrong with the James Morrison story, having noticed he couldn't answer detailed technical questions about cooking and seemed to lack the deep culinary knowledge his public persona claimed. My revelations confirmed their suspicions and gave them a compelling story about credit theft in the restaurant industry. Los Angeles Magazine, which had previously run a profile of James as an innovative culinary entrepreneur, published a correction and follow-up article accurately identifying me as the creator of Tierra y Fuego's cuisine. The article included a timeline of James's false claims alongside evidence of my actual creative authorship. The reporter who'd written the original profile apologized for being misled. The investor dinner James had scheduled became a public embarrassment. He tried to proceed with it, hiring a different chef to prepare a menu, but word had spread through the LA food community about the fraud and dissolution. Several investors canceled their attendance. Food bloggers who'd been invited showed up and wrote scathing reviews of the dinner, noting that food quality was poor and nothing like the dishes James had been previewing. One influential food blogger wrote, "The dinner James Morrison presented Tuesday night bore no resemblance to the innovative Oaxacan cuisine he'd been promoting for months." The obvious conclusion is that Morrison never created those dishes himself. His former partner, Elena Vázquez, was the actual culinary talent, and Morrison's entire reputation was built on stolen credit. The public exposure of James's theft spread rapidly through restaurant industry circles in Los Angeles and nationally. Chefs, restaurateurs, and food journalists shared the story as an example of business partners exploiting culinary talent while claiming creative credit. Several prominent chefs publicly supported me, condemning James's behavior and praising my decision to launch independently. Meanwhile, my own restaurant preparation was moving forward smoothly. The Silver Lake location was ready for build-out and equipment installation. Our suppliers confirmed they'd work exclusively with my new restaurant. I hired an excellent kitchen team, including a talented sous chef who'd wanted to work with me since learning about my recipe development. Local food media was excited about the opening, with several publications planning features. Most gratifying was the trademark decision. After reviewing my comprehensive documentation and James's lack of evidence showing creative authorship, the trademark office approved my applications for Tierra y Fuego and related intellectual property. James's attempt to contest the trademarks failed completely because he had no evidence of creating anything I claimed. The trademark approval meant James couldn't use the restaurant name, couldn't claim any ownership of the concept, and couldn't present any version of the menu I'd developed. His entire business plan had been built on my stolen work, and now he had nothing he could legally use. James tried to launch a different restaurant concept 6 months later, but his reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed by the credit theft scandal that he couldn't attract investors or quality culinary talent. The few chefs who agreed to work with him insisted on very public contracts clearly attributing all creative work to them, having learned from my experience how James operated. His restaurant opened to terrible reviews and closed within 4 months. The failure was covered in food media as a cautionary tale about businesspeople trying to build restaurant reputations on stolen culinary work. James's name became synonymous in LA food circles with credit theft and exploitation. Meanwhile, Elena Vázquez's Tierra y Fuego opened to enormous success. My opening night was attended by food critics, industry colleagues, and loyal supporters who'd followed the dissolution story. The restaurant was fully booked for its first 3 months based on advance publicity and excitement about authentic Oaxacan cuisine from a talented chef finally receiving proper credit. The reviews were exceptional. LA Times food critic called my mole negro the best in Los Angeles, a technically perfect preparation that honors traditional Oaxacan cooking while demonstrating refined culinary artistry. Multiple publications praised the restaurant as exactly what LA's Mexican food scene needed, combining authentic cultural traditions with sophisticated technique. Within 6 months, Tierra y Fuego received a Michelin star, rare recognition for a Mexican restaurant and validation of everything I'd worked toward. The Michelin Guide specifically praised my innovative approach to traditional Oaxacan cuisine, combining classical technique with deep respect for cultural authenticity. The Michelin star felt like complete vindication after years of exploitation. James had tried to build his reputation on my stolen work while keeping me invisible. Instead, I'd received the restaurant industry's highest recognition with proper attribution for cuisine I'd actually created. I also published a cookbook featuring recipes and stories from my grandmother alongside my own contemporary interpretations. The book became a bestseller, praised for its combination of cultural authenticity and sophisticated technique. Every recipe was clearly attributed to me or to my grandmother, proper recognition for the creative work James had tried to steal. 2 years after leaving James and launching Tierra y Fuego, I'm 35 years old and running a successful Michelin-starred restaurant that's become one of LA's most celebrated dining destinations. I've expanded to a second location, hired a team of talented cooks, and established myself as a leading voice in contemporary Mexican cuisine. The experience with James taught me crucial lessons about protecting creative work and the importance of documentation when facing exploitation. I learned that confronting theft directly is often ineffective when business partners are skilled manipulators, and that sometimes the best response is building independent success while exposing fraud through evidence and publicity. I've become an advocate for chefs facing credit theft or exploitation, speaking at culinary schools and industry events about protecting intellectual property and ensuring proper attribution. I share my story openly, explaining how business partners sometimes steal creative credit and what chefs can do legally to protect their work. I occasionally see James's name mentioned in food industry discussions, always in connection with the credit theft scandal that destroyed his reputation. He never recovered professionally from the public exposure of his fraud. He's unemployable in restaurants and unable to attract investors for any new ventures. Meanwhile, I'm thriving with proper recognition for my work, cooking food that honors my heritage while demonstrating culinary excellence, and mentoring young chefs about protecting their creative contributions. The trajectory James tried to prevent through credit theft not only happened but exceeded anything I'd imagined when we first formed our partnership. If this story resonates with you, if you've had your creative culinary work stolen by partners or restaurant owners, remember that documentation is essential and legal protection matters. Copyright your recipes, photograph your dishes with dates, and keep records of your creative development. Build your reputation independent of exploitative partnerships. Take action from positions of strength. Hit subscribe to join our community that believes culinary theft deserves exposure and consequences. Share this with someone whose recipes or cooking is being exploited without proper credit. And remember that the best response to creative theft often combines personal success with public exposure of fraud. The chef whose recipes were stolen for 14 months opened a Michelin-starred restaurant while her partner's restaurant failed. The partner who claimed credit for cooking he didn't create became unemployable in the industry. And the cuisine that was stolen finally carried the right name, establishing exactly the reputation its true creator deserved. Sometimes justice requires patience and strategic planning rather than immediate confrontation. Sometimes protecting your creative work means leaving exploitative partnerships and building independently. Sometimes the best revenge is succeeding brilliantly while the exploiter faces complete professional destruction. James thought he could build a restaurant reputation on my stolen recipes because the industry often enables such exploitation through power dynamics and inadequate attribution practices. He was wrong. His victim documented systematically, secured legal protections, built independent success, and then exposed his fraud to every person who mattered in LA food culture. The invisible chef became a celebrated Michelin-starred restaurateur. The credit thief became unemployable and discredited. And the recipes that were stolen were finally properly attributed, creating success for their actual creator while destroying the reputation of the person who'd tried to claim them. That's what happens when you steal from someone talented, strategic, and patient enough to document everything before taking action. You think you're building a reputation on borrowed culinary genius. Actually, you're creating evidence that will destroy you once your victim secures legal protection and decides the time is right to expose your fraud publicly. The success of Tierra y Fuego created opportunities I'd never imagined when I was working in James's shadow. Food Network contacted me about hosting a cooking show focused on contemporary Mexican cuisine and traditional techniques. The show, called Roots and Refinement, would let me share my grandmother's culinary knowledge alongside my own innovations with a national audience. The show format appealed to me because it emphasized cultural authenticity and proper attribution. Each episode would feature me discussing specific traditional techniques from my grandmother or other family members, then demonstrating how I'd adapted those techniques for contemporary fine dining. The show would give proper credit to the cultural traditions that informed my cooking rather than presenting innovation as emerging from nowhere. Filming the first season of Roots and Refinement was rewarding in ways restaurant cooking never could be. I could explain not just how to make dishes but why certain techniques mattered, what cultural significance different ingredients held, how food connected to family and memory and identity. The show let me be both chef and educator, sharing knowledge that might otherwise remain within families and communities. The show's success brought even more attention to Tierra y Fuego and to my approach to Mexican cuisine. Reservations became even more difficult to secure. Food tourists from across the country added my restaurant to their LA itineraries. James had tried to keep me invisible while claiming my work, and instead I'd become one of the most visible chefs in American Mexican cuisine. I also started teaching periodic workshops at culinary schools, focusing on traditional Mexican techniques and on protecting intellectual property in restaurant partnerships. The workshops combined hands-on cooking instruction with practical information about copyright, trademarks, and contract negotiation. I wanted to help young chefs avoid the exploitation I'd experienced. During one workshop at the Culinary Institute of America, a young Latina student approached me afterward in tears. She said she'd been developing recipes for a restaurant project with a business partner who was increasingly taking credit for her creative work. She said my story had helped her recognize the exploitation pattern before it became as systematic as what I'd experienced with James. We talked for over an hour about her specific situation, and I helped her develop a strategy for documenting her work and protecting her recipes legally before the exploitation escalated further. 6 months later, she emailed to say she'd successfully negotiated a new partnership agreement with clear intellectual property protections, using documentation strategies I'd taught her. Those conversations with young chefs felt as meaningful as any Michelin star. I was using my painful experience to prevent others from being similarly exploited, transforming individual injustice into collective protection. Each chef I helped avoid credit theft felt like retroactive justice for what James had done to me. My mother attended the Michelin star ceremony when Tierra y Fuego received its recognition. Watching her see me honored for cuisine that reflected our family's traditions while receiving proper credit was profoundly emotional for both of us. She'd experienced systematic theft of her recipes with no recourse or recognition. I'd faced similar exploitation but had documentation, legal protection, and the privilege of citizenship that let me fight back successfully. After the ceremony, my mother told me she was proud not just of my culinary success but of how I'd refused to accept exploitation quietly. She said she'd always regretted not fighting back when her recipes were stolen, but she'd been too vulnerable and frightened. She said watching me stand up for proper credit helped heal her own experience of theft and silencing. That conversation made me think about the broader context of credit theft in restaurant kitchens, particularly how it affects immigrants, women, and people of color who often have the least power to demand recognition. Many talented cooks work in kitchens where owners or executive chefs claim credit for their innovations, and most never have the resources or security to challenge that exploitation. I started using my platform to advocate for better attribution practices throughout the restaurant industry. I wrote op-eds about kitchen exploitation, gave interviews about credit theft, and partnered with culinary organizations to develop best practices for ensuring proper recognition of all contributors to restaurant menus. One initiative I'm particularly proud of involves working with the James Beard Foundation to create guidelines for crediting culinary contributions in restaurant awards and media coverage. The guidelines emphasize that journalists and awards committees should verify actual authorship of dishes rather than defaulting to crediting whoever owns the restaurant or holds the executive chef title. The guidelines also recommend that restaurants publicly credit specific cooks or sous chefs who develop signature dishes, similar to how art museums credit specific artists rather than just the institution. The recommendation challenges traditional kitchen hierarchies that enable credit theft by making individual contributions invisible. Some established chefs and restaurateurs resist these changes, arguing that kitchen work is inherently collaborative and that individual attribution is impractical or divisive. But I know from experience that resistance often comes from people who benefit from the current system's ambiguity, people who've built reputations partly on uncredited contributions from talented subordinates. The pushback reminds me of James's defenses when I confronted him about credit theft. He'd claimed partnership made everything collaborative, that demanding individual attribution was territorial and undermined teamwork. Those arguments protected his theft while making my demand for credit seem inappropriate. But proper attribution doesn't undermine collaboration. It actually strengthens collaborative work by ensuring everyone receives recognition for their contributions. When people know their work will be credited appropriately, they're more motivated to contribute creatively and more willing to share knowledge without fear of theft. Tierra y Fuego models this approach in our own kitchen. When sous chefs or line cooks develop new dishes or techniques, we publicly credit them on our menu and in media interviews. Several of our cooks have built their own reputations through proper attribution of their work at our restaurant, launching successful independent careers. One of our former sous chefs, Maria Gonzalez, recently opened her own restaurant after developing a following based on dishes she'd created at Tierra y Fuego and received proper credit for. Her success demonstrates that giving credit doesn't diminish the chef or restaurant providing the platform. It actually enhances our reputation as a place that values and recognizes talent. James's exploitative approach, claiming all credit for himself while keeping me invisible, ultimately destroyed him professionally. My approach, sharing credit appropriately and publicly acknowledging contributions, has built a stronger restaurant and a more loyal team. The contrast demonstrates that exploitation isn't just morally wrong but strategically foolish. I've also mentored several young chefs through their own restaurant openings, helping them avoid the pitfalls I experienced with James. I review partnership agreements, suggest intellectual property protections, and connect emerging chefs with attorneys who understand restaurant law. Several successful LA restaurants were launched by chefs I advised, all with strong legal protections ensuring proper credit. One mentee, Chef David Park, specifically credits my advice for helping him negotiate a partnership agreement that preserved his creative ownership while bringing in a business partner for operational support. His restaurant has been successful partly because the clear attribution and credit structure prevented the exploitation and resentment that destroyed my partnership with James. These mentorship relationships feel like creating the support system I wish I'd had when starting Tierra y Fuego with James. If an experienced chef had warned me about credit theft risks, helped me understand intellectual property law, and advised me on documenting my work from the beginning, maybe I could have prevented James's exploitation entirely. But maybe the exploitation was necessary to make me the advocate I've become. My painful experience gave me credibility and knowledge that makes my advocacy effective. Young chefs listen to my warnings about credit theft because I've lived through it, documented it, and successfully fought back against it. The restaurant industry still has significant problems with credit theft and exploitation, particularly affecting women, immigrants, and people of color. But conversations about proper attribution are happening more frequently and more seriously partly because of public stories like mine. Each exposed case of credit theft makes the next case slightly easier to address. James's downfall sent a message throughout LA food culture that credit theft would have consequences, that talented chefs wouldn't necessarily stay silent about exploitation, that business partners couldn't build reputations on stolen work without risk of exposure. Several chefs told me privately that my case made them more careful about properly crediting collaborators. 3 years after leaving James and launching Tierra y Fuego, I'm financially successful, professionally respected, and using my platform to help others. The success James tried to steal for himself has exceeded anything he imagined, all properly attributed to the person who actually created it. My daughters, who are 5 and 3 years old now, come to the restaurant occasionally and sit in the kitchen watching me cook. They're growing up seeing their mother as a chef, a business owner, an advocate, someone whose name is on her own work. I want them to understand that creative contributions deserve recognition, that exploitation should be resisted, that documentation and strategic planning can overcome power imbalances. My older daughter already plays restaurant with her toys, creating elaborate menus and cooking imaginary dishes. She tells people confidently that she's going to be a chef like her mother, maybe even take over Tierra y Fuego someday. Watching her embody those possibilities naturally feels like intergenerational healing. My grandmother passed away a year ago at 92, just after Tierra y Fuego received its Michelin star. She lived long enough to see her traditional cooking knowledge celebrated at the highest levels of culinary recognition, properly credited and contextualized rather than stolen and decontextualized by someone claiming innovation. At her funeral, I talked about how her teaching had shaped everything about my cooking and how Tierra y Fuego honored her knowledge while demonstrating that traditional Mexican cuisine deserved the same respect as any European culinary tradition. I said the Michelin star was as much hers as mine, recognition for knowledge she'd preserved and transmitted. That connection between my grandmother's traditional knowledge and my contemporary success represents exactly what James tried to sever. He wanted to present innovative Oaxacan cuisine as emerging from his creative genius, erasing the cultural traditions and family knowledge that actually informed every dish. He wanted innovation without tradition, genius without context, success without proper attribution. But cuisine doesn't emerge from nowhere. Every dish reflects traditions, influences, teachers, family knowledge. The mole negro James claimed as his innovative recipe represented my grandmother's traditional preparation refined through my training and experimentation. Claiming it as individual innovation erased generations of knowledge transmission. By fighting for proper credit, I wasn't just protecting my individual authorship. I was protecting proper attribution of cultural knowledge and family traditions. I was ensuring my grandmother and mother received recognition for their contributions to my culinary education. The fight against James's credit theft was partly a fight against cultural erasure. That broader significance makes my success feel like more than personal vindication. Tierra y Fuego's Michelin star was recognition that Mexican cuisine, particularly traditional Oaxacan cooking, deserved elite culinary status. The restaurant's success demonstrated that honoring cultural traditions while applying contemporary technique created cuisine as sophisticated as any European cooking. James wanted to present that sophistication as emerging from his innovative mind, the classic pattern of cultural appropriation where dominant groups claim credit for marginalized groups' knowledge. My fight against his credit theft was also resistance to that appropriation, insistence that cultural origins and traditions be properly acknowledged. The restaurant industry still struggles with appropriate cultural attribution. Too many restaurants present fusion, or innovative, cuisine that's really traditional cooking from other cultures repackaged with fancy plating and higher prices, often without crediting the cultures being borrowed from or employing people from those communities. I try to model better practices at Tierra y Fuego by emphasizing cultural context, employing primarily Mexican and Mexican-American cooks, and explicitly crediting traditional techniques and family knowledge. Our menu includes descriptions explaining cultural significance of dishes, not just ingredients and preparation. Some food critics have praised this approach as demonstrating respect for culinary traditions while innovating within them. Others have questioned whether it's necessary, suggesting people come to restaurants for food, not cultural education. But I believe proper attribution and cultural context enhance dining experiences rather than detracting from them. The same principles that made me fight James's credit theft apply to broader questions of cultural attribution in cooking. If my individual creative contributions deserve recognition, so do the cultural traditions and communities that inform contemporary cuisine. The fight against exploitation extends beyond individual cases to systemic issues of how we credit and compensate knowledge. Looking back at my entire career arc, from learning to cook at my grandmother's side through culinary school and Chef Chen's kitchen to the exploitation by James and eventual triumph with Tierra y Fuego, I see a story about protecting creative work, demanding proper credit, and transforming individual experience into broader advocacy. James tried to steal my success by claiming my recipes and erasing my contributions. Instead, his theft became the catalyst for success exceeding what either of us imagined, success that's properly attributed and used to help others avoid similar exploitation. The chef James tried to keep invisible became one of the most visible figures in American Mexican cuisine. The recipes he tried to steal became signatures of a Michelin-starred restaurant carrying the right name. And the exploitation he inflicted became a case study in how to resist credit theft successfully. That's what happens when you steal from someone talented enough to create success independently, strategic enough to document systematically, and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to expose fraud. You think you're building a reputation on borrowed culinary genius. Actually, you're creating the evidence and motivation for your own destruction while catalyzing your victim's rise to success you tried to prevent. James learned that lesson too late to save his reputation. The restaurant industry learned it in time to implement better attribution practices. And I learned that surviving exploitation and achieving strategic vindication can transform individual injustice into catalyst for meaningful systemic change. The invisible chef became visible and celebrated. The stolen recipes were correctly attributed. The exploiter became unemployable and discredited. And the broader industry became slightly more just because one person refused to accept credit theft and responded with documentation, legal protection, and strategic exposure of fraud. 5 years after opening Tierra y Fuego, the restaurant has become an LA institution, consistently ranked among the city's best restaurants and maintaining its Michelin star through each annual evaluation. The success is built on consistent excellence, proper attribution, and the culinary vision I developed over years of training and family tradition. I've expanded to a second Tierra y Fuego location in San Diego, bringing my approach to contemporary Oaxacan cuisine to another city with significant Mexican-American population and strong food culture. The San Diego restaurant opened to similar acclaim as the LA original, demonstrating that the concept was strong enough to succeed in multiple markets. Opening the second location required hiring a chef de cuisine I could trust to execute my recipes and maintain quality standards while I split time between both restaurants. I chose carefully, promoting my longtime sous chef Ana Martinez, who'd worked with me since Tierra y Fuego's opening and understood both the technical requirements and the cultural significance of our cuisine. Ana's promotion with proper credit as chef de cuisine of the San Diego location demonstrates the leadership development that happens when restaurants properly recognize talent. She's received significant press coverage in her own right, building her professional reputation while maintaining quality at our second location. Her success reflects well on both her abilities and on our restaurant's commitment to developing and crediting team members. The contrast with how James treated me is stark. He kept me invisible while claiming my work, preventing me from building the professional reputation I deserved. I give Ana and other talented team members public platforms and proper attribution, helping them build careers while maintaining excellent standards at both locations. Several of our former team members have gone on to open their own successful restaurants after gaining experience and recognition at Tierra y Fuego. Each one received proper credit for their contributions during their time with us and left with my full support and encouragement. Building a reputation as a restaurant that develops talent and gives proper credit makes recruiting excellent cooks easier. The second cookbook I published 2 years ago became another bestseller, this time focusing on contemporary applications of traditional Mexican techniques. The book included contributions from Ana and several other Tierra y Fuego team members, all properly credited for their recipe development and ideas. The collaborative approach to the cookbook demonstrated that sharing credit enhances rather than diminishes success. James's exploitative approach, claiming all credit for himself, ultimately left him isolated and unable to build a team. My approach, sharing credit generously and developing talent, has built a stronger organization and opened opportunities for multiple people. The long-term outcomes clearly demonstrate which approach works better both morally and practically. I've also become involved in advocacy work around immigration and restaurant labor, using my platform to discuss how undocumented workers contribute to American cuisine while often facing exploitation and lack of credit. Many of the most talented cooks in professional kitchens are immigrants, yet their contributions are often invisible while restaurant owners and executive chefs receive all public recognition. This advocacy connects to my mother's experience as an undocumented cook whose recipes were stolen without recourse. She couldn't fight back against exploitation because her immigration status made her too vulnerable. I can fight for better treatment of restaurant workers partly because I have citizenship privilege that protected me when confronting James's theft. The immigration advocacy has sometimes been controversial, with some people suggesting I should focus on cooking rather than politics. But I don't see these issues as separate. Food is inherently political, connected to questions of culture, labor, attribution, and power. Advocating for proper treatment and recognition of immigrant cooks is inseparable from my own fight against credit theft. I've testified before California state legislature about restaurant labor practices, sharing my mother's story alongside broader data about exploitation in professional kitchens. Some of that testimony focused specifically on credit theft and intellectual property issues, arguing that cooks who develop recipes deserve legal protection and proper attribution regardless of immigration status. The legislative advocacy led to California passing stronger protections for recipe developers, making it easier for cooks to assert intellectual property rights over their culinary creations. The law doesn't solve all problems, but it provides additional legal tools for fighting credit theft in restaurant contexts. That legislative success feels like transforming my individual experience with James into systemic change that protects others. One person's credit theft case became evidence supporting policy reforms that benefit thousands of restaurant workers. The broader impact makes the painful experience of exploitation feel more meaningful. My daughters are growing up witnessing these various dimensions of my work: the cooking and restaurant management, the media presence and cookbook writing, the advocacy and legislative testimony. They're seeing that success involves not just personal achievement but using privilege and platform to help others. When my older daughter asks why I spend time talking to legislators or teaching workshops instead of just cooking, I explain that helping other chefs avoid exploitation is as important as making good food. I want her to understand that people with success and visibility have responsibility to address unfair systems, not just benefit individually from their own hard work. That lesson about using success for broader good is something my grandmother taught me, though in different context. She was known in our community not just for her cooking but for sharing knowledge generously, teaching younger women traditional techniques, and using food to bring people together. Her generosity with knowledge and emphasis on community over individual achievement shaped my approach to success. James's approach was fundamentally selfish, focused on building his individual reputation regardless of who he exploited. My grandmother's approach was fundamentally generous, focused on preserving and sharing knowledge for community benefit. The contrast between those philosophies explains both why James failed ultimately and why my success has felt sustainable and meaningful. The Michelin recognition, the television show, the best-selling cookbooks, the expanding restaurant business, all of it matters and feels validating. But the success that resonates most deeply involves helping young chefs avoid exploitation, advocating for better attribution practices, protecting cultural knowledge, and using my platform to address systemic inequities in restaurants. Those broader impacts transform my individual story from personal revenge narrative into something larger about resisting exploitation, demanding justice, and using painful experiences to catalyze positive change. James tried to steal my success, and instead his theft became the foundation for success that extends far beyond my individual achievement. When food journalists ask about the credit theft experience with James, I always emphasize the importance of documentation and legal protection. I describe the specific steps I took: copywriting written recipes, photographing dishes with dates, keeping detailed development notes, consulting with intellectual property attorneys, and building independent industry relationships before confronting theft. The practical advice helps other chefs facing similar exploitation understand that responding effectively requires preparation rather than impulsive confrontation. Many people experiencing credit theft feel powerless, and I want them to know that strategic planning and proper documentation can overcome power imbalances even when exploiters seem protected by connections and resources. I also emphasize that leaving exploitative partnerships is often necessary, that trying to fix relationships with people who've demonstrated willingness to steal credit rarely works well. James proved through 14 months of systematic theft that he valued his reputation more than partnership integrity. No amount of confrontation would have changed his fundamental selfishness. The hard lesson from my experience is that some people will exploit you if given opportunity, and the best response is documenting thoroughly, protecting yourself legally, building independent success, and exposing exploitation from positions of strength. That's not the inspirational message people always want to hear, but it's the realistic advice that helps people respond effectively to workplace theft. Looking back now at that Tuesday morning when I dissolved the partnership with James, I see it as one of the best professional decisions I ever made despite the fear and uncertainty I felt at the time. Walking away from guaranteed restaurant opening with funding in place felt terrifying. Betting on myself to succeed independently required confidence that exploitation had seriously undermined. But staying with James would have meant continuing to watch him claim credit for my work, continuing to be invisible while he built a fraudulent reputation, continuing to accept exploitation that made me angry and demoralized. Leaving was hard, but staying would have been corrosive to both my career and my sense of self-worth. The success I've achieved independently validates that difficult decision. Tierra y Fuego has thrived in ways it never would have under James's exploitative leadership. I've developed as a chef, business owner, and public figure in ways that would have been impossible while staying invisible in his shadow. The risk of independence was worth taking. That lesson about the value of betting on yourself, of refusing to accept exploitation even when leaving feels risky, is something I emphasize when mentoring young chefs. Too often talented people stay in exploitative situations because leaving seems scarier than enduring ongoing mistreatment. But enduring exploitation has costs too, costs to your reputation, your career development, and your psychological well-being. Sometimes the risky choice is actually the safer long-term option. Staying with James would have meant years of having my best work stolen, my contributions erased, my potential suppressed. Leaving meant uncertainty but also possibility, the chance to build something properly attributed and fully under my control. The 5 years since leaving have proven that possibility was real, that independence was achievable, that success without exploitation was possible. James tried to make me believe I needed him, that I couldn't succeed without his business expertise and connections. He was catastrophically wrong, and his miscalculation cost him everything while elevating me beyond what I'd imagined possible. The chef he tried to keep invisible became one of American Mexican cuisine's most celebrated figures. The recipes he tried to steal became signatures of multiple Michelin-starred restaurants. The exploitation he inflicted became catalyst for systemic reforms and advocacy work. Every attempt he made to suppress my success ultimately amplified it, creating motivation and platform for achievements he tried to prevent. That irony, that James's credit theft catalyzed success exceeding what either of us imagined, represents the most complete form of justice. He wanted to build his reputation on my stolen work. Instead, his theft became the origin story for my independent success, the narrative that made me sympathetic, visible, and determined to help others avoid similar exploitation. The story of overcoming James's credit theft is now inseparable from my professional identity. Journalists always mention it when profiling me. Culinary schools use it as case study when teaching about intellectual property. Young chefs seeking advice contact me specifically because they know I've experienced and successfully fought back against exploitation. James tried to write me out of the Tierra y Fuego story, but instead he became a footnote in my story, the villain whose theft catalyzed my rise. His name is remembered primarily in connection with credit theft scandal, while my name is associated with culinary excellence, cultural authenticity, and successful advocacy for better attribution practices. 5 years after dissolving our partnership, I rarely think about James except when telling my story to help others. He's not part of my daily life or future plans. He's just the person who tried to steal credit I deserved and failed, creating through his exploitation the evidence and motivation for justice. The best revenge really is living well, succeeding dramatically, and using your platform to prevent others from experiencing similar injustice. James is living with the consequences of his credit theft, unemployable and discredited. I'm living with the consequences of refusing to accept exploitation, thriving personally and professionally while helping others. That's the outcome when exploitation meets someone smart enough to document systematically, strategic enough to plan carefully, talented enough to succeed independently, and generous enough to transform personal justice into broader advocacy. The invisible chef became visible and celebrated. The stolen recipes were correctly attributed. The exploiter was destroyed and discredited. And the broader restaurant industry became slightly more just because one person refused to stay silent about credit theft.